It was midnight on Halloween, and a thick fog lay heavily over St. Mark's Asylum, a place shunned by everyone in the small town. For years, rumors had painted the old hospital as haunted. Whispers of anguished screams, ghostly figures, and flickering lights at odd hours circulated constantly. No one dared to venture inside, but four friends, Chris, Megan, Alex, and Sarah, had long been fascinated by horror stories and ghost-hunting adventures. This Halloween, they were determined to uncover the secrets hidden in the hospital's decaying walls. Armed with flashlights, a camera, and a handheld recorder, they parked a short walk away and began their trek toward the looming, decaying building. Their breath misted in the cold night air, and a sense of dread settled over them as they neared the front doors. Once they stepped inside, the darkness wrapped around them like a thick blanket. The air felt oppressive, thick with dust, and something else that they couldn't quite place. Megan flicked on her flashlight, casting a narrow beam of light down the main corridor, illuminating peeling paint and old hospital equipment strewn across the floor. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional dripping from somewhere deep within the building. Sarah shivered, rubbing her arms. "This place feels wrong," she muttered, her voice barely more than a whisper. Chris, always the bravest of the group, chuckled nervously, trying to keep the mood light. "Come on, guys. It's just an old abandoned hospital." The group moved deeper into the building, passing by empty rooms filled with broken gurneys and rusted medical instruments. Every so often, they'd hear faint noises, footsteps echoing in the distance, whispers that seemed to come from just around the corner, the creak of doors that hadn't been touched in years. The further they ventured, the more they felt like they were being watched. Sarah kept glancing over her shoulder, certain she'd seen a shadow move out of the corner of her eye, but every time she turned, the hallway was empty. As they reached the second floor, they found a patient ward with several doors lining the walls. One of the doors, marked Room 23, was slightly ajar, as though someone had left it open in a hurry. Curious, Alex pushed the door open, revealing a room with a single bed, its sheets tattered and stained. On the walls were crude drawings in red paint, or was it something else, of strange symbols and words in a language none of them recognized. Chris shined his flashlight on the drawings, laughing nervously. Whoever stayed here must have been pretty disturbed. Then they heard it. A faint, echoing sound, like a woman sobbing somewhere down the hall. They all froze, exchanging uneasy glances. The sound grew louder, accompanied by a cold breeze that seemed to come from nowhere, chilling them to the bone. Sarah's hand trembled as she held onto Alex's arm. "Did you guys hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Alex nodded, his face pale. Let's check it out. It's probably just the wind or something." The friends followed the sound, which led them to the end of the corridor and up a narrow flight of stairs. They reached the third floor, which had been the psychiatric ward. The walls were covered in more of the strange symbols, along with crude drawings of eyes, hands, and twisted faces. The sobbing grew louder, coming from a room marked Isolation Room. Swallowing his fear, Chris pushed the door open, revealing a dark, empty room with a single cracked mirror on the wall. As they stepped inside, the sobbing stopped abruptly, and an eerie silence filled the room. Alex aimed his flashlight at the mirror, and for a brief moment, they all saw it. A shadowy figure standing behind them, its face contorted into a silent scream. But when they turned, there was nothing there. Sarah let out a shaky breath. "We need to get out of here," she whispered. her eyes wide with fear. But Chris was determined to keep going, his curiosity outweighing his fear. "Come on, guys. We've made it this far. Let's at least check out the basement." Reluctantly, the group made their way down to the basement, where the most disturbing experiments were rumored to have taken place. The air grew colder and heavier, and the walls seemed to close in on them. The basement was filled with old medical equipment, jars containing unidentifiable specimens, and papers scattered across the floor. A thick layer of dust covered everything, and the smell of decay was almost unbearable. As they explored the basement, Megan found an old journal lying on a desk, its pages filled with detailed notes about the experiments conducted on patients. The entries became more disturbing as she read on, detailing how the doctors had tortured their patients, performing inhumane tests in the name of science. One entry described an experiment where patients were forced to stare into a mirror for hours on end, claiming that they could see the other side. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the basement, and the lights in the building flickered before plunging them into darkness. Panic set in, and they scrambled to find each other, their flashlights barely illuminating the pitch-black room. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. They all felt it then, a presence, cold and malevolent, watching them from the shadows. Chris raised his camera, hoping to capture something, anything, on film. He aimed it down the hallway, and through the camera lens, he saw a figure standing at the far end. A woman in a hospital gown, her eyes hollow and empty, staring directly at him. He lowered the camera, but when he looked again, the figure was gone. "We need to leave now," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. They ran through the basement, trying to find the stairs, but every corridor seemed to lead them in circles. The walls felt like they were closing in on them, and the air grew colder with each passing second. Sarah suddenly stopped, clutching her chest. I can't breathe," she gasped, collapsing to her knees. The others gathered around her, trying to help, but then they heard it again. The faint sound of a woman sobbing, coming from just around the corner. The sobbing grew louder, turning into a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the basement. They turned to run, but the figure appeared in front of them, blocking their path. Her face was twisted in agony, her eyes empty and lifeless. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, only silence, deep and suffocating. The friends backed away, terrified, but the figure moved closer, reaching out with cold, skeletal hands. In a panic, they finally found the staircase and scrambled up to the first floor, but the front doors were locked. They pounded on the doors, screaming for help, but there was no one outside. Then they heard footsteps behind them. Turning around, they saw a group of shadowy figures standing in the hallway, watching them with hollow eyes. With no other options, they ran back through the hospital, trying to find another way out. Every door they tried was locked, and every hallway seemed to lead them back to the same spot. The shadows grew closer, their whispers filling the air. Sarah began to sob, clutching onto Megan as they huddled together, terrified. Finally, they found a small window in one of the rooms on the ground floor. Chris shattered it with his flashlight, and one by one, they climbed out, escaping into the cold night air. They ran back to their car, not stopping until they were safely inside. As they drove away, they looked back at the hospital, seeing the shadowy figures watching them from the windows, their faces twisted into silent screams. When they returned home, they tried to put the experience behind them, but each of them was haunted by nightmares of the hospital. Chris reviewed the footage on his camera, hoping to find an explanation, but all he saw were shadowy figures and the faces of his friends, twisted in fear. In the final shot, just before the camera cut out, he saw the woman in the hospital gown standing behind him, her hand reaching out toward the lens. The friends never spoke of the hospital again, but they could never shake the feeling that something had followed them home. And every so often, when they looked into a mirror, they would see a shadow standing just behind them, watching, waiting